vanilla and ranch and chicken. It's disgusting even by fast food standards.
God, absolutely crazy.
The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com.
Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Steve Casella, president of the Massing Polling Group, and it is Thursday, March 19th. Today, we're talking about polling, as always, polling on Iran, polling on the economy, and polling on many other things. Then, we'll check in on courts, ballot questions, and where they're currently meeting. All right, Jen. From what I'm given to understand, it is now almost spring in Boston. I gather things are warming up, snow is melting, warm weather's breaking out everywhere. Jen, it is your favorite time of year. How much of that is true?
It's true that we're finally losing some of the snow that was up at almost my shoulder level until really recently, but that does mean instead that I regret not having a solid galoshes-based wardrobe for walking around Boston and dodging these piles.
That's true. I don't really think about you as having like the wellies and, you know, that sort of thing, like the rain, the yellow, like Paddington Bear style raincoat.
I was gonna say, when you think of me, you don't immediately think that's like an adorable little bear that loves marmalade, loves a yellow hat. I'm shocked. I'm hurt. I'm wounded. But, and I will say this is a point of pride here, my delicate disposition actually really leans toward the cold, the gloomy, the moody, which means that when I ask you what it's like in Kenya right now and what spring and summertime activities you get to participate in on a daily basis, it only hurts our listeners. It's never hurt me once.
Well, in that case, let me hurt our listeners because I just got back from the Kenyan coast today, which is absolutely stunning. Just a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. I was down in a place called Kilifi, which is a little bit further south on the coast and, you know, a lot of classic beach stuff to do. But one of the cool things that you actually get to do is climb baobab trees, which are those gigantic, massive trees that are easily 20 feet around, maybe even more than that. Among the many interesting things about them is that they grow with what seem to be like perfectly designed climbing holds, like growing into the bark. So you can actually just like put up a rope and climb them as if you're rock climbing, which I'd never done before, but got to do yesterday and was super cool.
Real ones know that the way that you should be familiar with a baobab tree is from the classic Le Petit Prince, or The Little Prince, where there is that little planet covered in the baobab trees. So that is, in fact, my pitch here. Don't go hang out in the beautiful sunshine and climb them. Sit in your living room and read an adorable little French children's story.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and they grow kind of all over the place, too. There's actually, as I learned, a club of people who what they do is they all get together on bikes and ride out to find a new baobab tree and then put up ropes and climb it. It's just the most like wonderful, like earth affirming thing I can possibly imagine.
That is so lovely, and I hope our listeners have been sufficiently wounded here. We can wound them further by talking about polling, which I hear we're going to do. Is that why we're here today?
Polling will bring joy to everybody's heart. So we have polls on many things, and we should get into them. And then a little bit later, we're going to talk about ballot questions. So should we get started?
Let's go. It seems like every week we roll back here into the virtual bunker or the real bunker, depending on where you are, and you and I look at each other, Steve, and we go, buddy, there is so much going on. And for all of these news items, we can turn to the sweet, sweet comfort of polling until at least every polling company crumbles under the president's ire. That was bleak. Sorry, Steve. Do you want to talk about Iran?
Never going to happen. Never going to crumble. But yes, let's talk about Iran. Let's talk about the economy. There's lots of new polling out and some really interesting things to cover.
Okay, well, let's start with where we suggested we start, which is no, not the president saying we'll just take Cuba this week. We're not going to deal with that right now. We have polling on how the American people feel about the decision to enter into what is, by all accounts, a war, even though the White House kind of takes issue with that phrasing, even as they intermittently use it. Steve, walk me through this. What do we know about how people feel about intervention in Iran?
Yeah, there's a bunch of interesting things in here, and I have to, give a shout out to all my fellow pollsters who have been digging into it from a bunch of different angles in some really interesting ways. Some of the highlights are there hasn't really been a so-called rally around the flag bounce. This is something that over on the Strength in Numbers website by G. Elliott Morris, he's been looking at this, and there are many instances in history where there have been very large so-called rally around the flag bounces, the idea being where when a war starts, Americans, view their government and their president more positively because they think whatever the war was, whether it was the first Gulf War or, responding to Pearl Harbor and so forth, or even Afghanistan and Iraq, like there were some pretty high presidential approval rating numbers at those points. Obviously the circumstances are extremely different. Pearl Harbor, of course, was a significant attack on the homeland, and Afghanistan was following an attack on the homeland. So, you can easily see why there were significant bounces in responding to those. This was, of course, not that. This was a war of choice. This is a war of choice. I'm perfectly comfortable calling it a war. It might not last very long, that's fine, and maybe that would be different than other wars, but, we're using military equipment to blow up a bunch of stuff in another country, so I'm comfortable calling that a war.
And looking at how people feel about this, as usual, when we're looking at these kind of spreads on how people feel about President Trump's actions, but it's also true of other presidents, the partisan spread is usually pretty predictable. So let's start with actually the independence of this all. The people where if they could go either way, how do they feel about this action?
And the answer to that is by and large not very positively. Independents are by and large not wild about this. I will say that one of the other things that the polls have found is that depending on how you ask the question and whether it's, Donald Trump's decision to strike Iran or if it's, the military operation currently going on in Iran, those two kinds of sets of phrasing can produce very different results. But by and large, I'd say, the polling has found that independents do not love it. A Marist University poll in March found 59% disapprove of the handling of Iran. CNN found 32% say that they do approve of the strikes. Quinnipiac also did it and found 60 to 31 in opposition. So there's, a bunch of polls that are kind of all pointing in the same direction.
So then getting into that partisan aspect of it there, I presume Democrats are not in favor of this by and large. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but presuming I am right about that, how do the Republicans feel, given that Trump campaigned on pledges of no new wars?
Yes, you are correct about how Democrats feel, not surprisingly. Democrats favor almost nothing that Donald Trump is doing, and this is a very strong case of that. Republicans are pretty much in the other direction, pretty much unified in the other direction, not entirely, and the ones that you kind of are actually competing over are the ones that are sort of lean to the center Republicans. You might shave off a few MAGA Republicans where they might have some other objection to what's happening over there. There's very complicated dynamics interplaying between gas prices and, feelings about Israel and feelings about foreign wars in general. All of those things are kind of cross-pressure individual voters. But the net of it is that the very large, significant majority of Republicans are still in favor of what Donald Trump is doing. On balance, as the war has gone on, which is a funny thing to say since it's only been a few weeks, it's not quite as unpopular as when it started. The questions we're seeing now are somewhere closer to even, maybe still slightly underwater. It doesn't seem to be the, 30-60 or 20-70 we were seeing. And obviously with the large caveat that it still very much depends on how you ask the question. But it's not quite as clear that Americans are just strongly against this. This isn't quite the same as invading Canada or conquering Greenland or something like that. There seems to be a bit more support for this perhaps than there was.
Well, speaking of kind of very straightforward polling questions here, let's get into the economy of it all, because a lot of questions about how people feel about the economy ask it in a very specific, clear way, which is either How do you approve or disapprove of the way that the president is handling the economy? How do you think the president is handling the economy? So, being asked directly, how do they feel about the way that Trump is handling the economy?
Right. And there is one of the places where Donald Trump, I think, is really in trouble. When Republicans sense that Donald Trump is in trouble, and by extension, they are in trouble, which is there was this view, particularly at the beginning of Trump's current term, and particularly among, I'd say moderates to Republicans, like that sort of segment of the electorate, that this was going to be a good time for the economy and that the economy was going to do well. Inflation was going to be relatively low and prices were going to come down and all these things that Trump had talked about during the campaign. But that hasn't really been the way it's played out. At the moment, YouGov polling is finding that about the same number as when he took office actually think the economy is getting worse. There was also a poll from Yahoo, which they do their polling with YouGov, that found 61% disapprove of the way that Donald Trump is handling the economy, just 32% approve. So in general, I think that the numbers are just bad. Like they're bad. And gas prices certainly have not helped.
Right. And that does get to the idea that in every presidential campaign cycle, we really start to zero in on what the buzzwords are in any given year. And so affordability has basically been the thing to hammer since before the 2024 election. And so you've seen that be a very successful rallying cry for Democrats and centrists and even Republicans who are kind of trying to get pushes on some bipartisan standard legislation go through, that you have to tie everything to the idea of, will it make it easier for the average American to continue living their normal everyday life in the country? And so, Steve, I am curious, thinking about the past few years, actually, looking at the numbers on approval of how the president has been handling the economy, thinking back to how much Joe Biden and the incumbent parties across the world got dinged over the status of inflation, thinking back to the Great Depression and how that impacted presidential popularity here. You look at 61% of people disapproving of the way a president is handling the economy. What does that tell you heading into these midterms?
It's not a good number, and the sub numbers are also not very good on that. Some pollsters have also asked follow-up questions and about approval of very specific things. The Yahoo poll that I mentioned earlier, for example, also asked about Trump's approval to his approach to managing the cost of living. 26% approval on that, on 67% disapproval. And then you look at gas prices specifically, and people are thinking they're going to continue to go up, and 80% say that they're already too high. So you can argue about what the right price for gas should be historically, today, et cetera. But one thing is undeniable, which is that it is way higher than it was just a few weeks back, and there's a very clear causal relationship. Throughout history, there's often, lines about like, well, presidents can't really affect prices. They can't really affect gas prices, et cetera. And in most cases, there's something to be said for that argument. But in this case, there's a very, very clear cause for it. So, you can't really wriggle out of it or blame it on other things or blame it on some production issue or some refinement issue. It's the war in Iran, nothing else. And so he bears responsibility for it. And 80% of Americans think it's too high.
Well, I think that's probably not going to change in the near future, at least the next week. We'll see if we have to come back to it and see if people suddenly really enjoy high gas prices. But thanks, Steve, for taking me on this blissful and relaxing tour of the polls on these very sunny issues.
My pleasure. Last week on the pod with Chris Lazinski, we dove into legal fights over 3 possible ballot measures that Massachusetts voters could be faced with in November. Well, this week we're back with some updates. Since the last episode, Jen, there have been some developments on the roller coaster. That's what it says I'm supposed to say. I don't know how you get developments on a roller coaster, but perhaps there's been ups and downs on the roller coaster. So you fill me in on what they've been. Where should we start?
Well, I think we should start with the fact that I think people wait for us to drop our podcast to then follow up on exactly the subject matter that we've been discussing. So I think that's where we start there. Legislators immediately were like, You know what? They did a beautiful summary of what the legal status was of those ballot measures on the horse race. Let's try something.
Let's change it. Let us undercut what they said last week.
So the nice thing, at least, is everything we said was absolutely accurate, and those aren't even the ballot measures that we're dealing with this time around. So last week, we talked about the way that people were able to challenge a number of potential ballot measures up at the Supreme Judicial Court. So that's the highest court in Massachusetts. And you can basically say, hey, these things should never have been sent to the ballot in the first place. Keep them away from voters. They are not appropriate for an up or down vote. What we're dealing with this week is the Massachusetts Senate basically told reporters and under embargo, and then they released it, that they were planning on doing this sort of interesting and fairly rare thing called asking for the opinion of the justices on a few of these ballot measures. And so that means that under the state constitution, lawmakers are able to, in very serious and solemn legalistic manners, ask the justices, hey, should this law be allowed? Should this matter at all? Should we be allowed to act in this way? Should voters be allowed to consider this question? And so what we have now are two ballot measures that you are probably familiar with as part of kind of this transparency package, which is the one that would make the legislature and governor have to follow public records laws, and another that would adjust the way that legislative stipends are doled out. And those two things right now are what the Massachusetts Senate is asking the court to consider on a basic constitutional level.
And they're asking it, just to summarize, whether voters should be able to tell the legislature that, hey, yes, you should have to comply with public records law, and hey, no, you can't give stipends to quite as many people as you're currently doing. The legislature is basically implying voters should not be able to make these kinds of rules.
Yes. So they're trying to do a few things at once. They are asking the justices to kind of do the same thing that they would be doing in any of these other cases, which is say, hey, was this appropriate for the ballot at all? Like making that basic determination. But then the other thing that they're asking them to do is kind of consider the fundamental constitutionality of these things. So what they're arguing, for instance, is basically that these changes across two of them are going to infringe on lawmakers' abilities to basically set their own rules and proceedings. That part of the stipends question would basically set new policy for what would make someone eligible for stipends based on a new definition of work that the committees would need to be doing. So they're basically saying, well, you're effectively changing the rules and procedures of this independent body, this arm of government here. They also said that these public records changes would cool their, quote, freedom of deliberation, speech, and debate. And then the one that tickled me the most was they would like the court to declare that these measures would actually give the judicial branch improper power over the legislative branch. They want them to say, yeah, that's right, we shouldn't be in the business of basically determining whether or not you are following your own rules or whether you're abiding by public records laws. So it's kind of an interesting request. And ultimately, the thing to keep in mind is that it is non-binding. The reason they get to just ask the court what it thinks and they get this sort of report back from them saying, here is our legal review of these questions, is the entire point here is to basically say, well, this would inform the legislature as it considers what to do about these ballot measures.
I mean, let's say in a world where the Supreme Court comes back and offers this view that's in favor of what the legislature is hoping that they'll say, I would say pretty confidently what they're hoping they're going to say. What then would the legislature do? Which I ask because my understanding is they can either pass these ballot questions or, not do anything, in which case they go on to the ballot. So what could they do if it seems like the Supreme Judicial Court is agreeing with the legislature's position?
So you're absolutely right that lawmakers only have so many options, essentially two options here when it comes to the period that we're in, which is where a special joint committee of the legislature is considering all 11 of these potential ballot measures and kind of working through whether they want to pass them or just, say we don't think this is a good idea, but not do anything with it. So in this case, it means a few things because the lawmakers have 2 points of kind of major leverage in the situation. And one of them might be if they get an opinion from the justices saying, we have considered this unconstitutional, it shouldn't be presented to voters at all, then what they could do is go to proponents and essentially say, we have extremely solid grounds to just kind of ignore this, overrule it, not abide by it if it goes into effect. So one of the kind of limiting factors for the way the legislature can do its business around ballot measures, which in most ways, unless they're constitutional amendments, are just like any other law. So lawmakers could just change them later if they wanted to, except that the optics of doing that are often pretty bad. If people vote for something by and large, and then the people that they voted for come back in and they say, we hate what you did, we're just going to strike that out and change it, there are kind of public opinion reasons why they might not want to do that. So if they're basically saying, well, we're not going to follow this, we've been told it's unconstitutional, that makes it easier for them to say, this is null and void. They could argue it in front of the, SJC later if they wanted to say, we don't have to follow this, you can't enforce it. But the other thing that it can do is give them leverage on the earlier end, telling the proponents, hey, would you be amenable to withdrawing this if we don't think that it's going to hold up later? Could we alter the language if you withdraw it? Could we figure out some sort of bargain around that? So it's basically leverage and clarity.
Got it. Okay, so it would basically allow the legislature to lean on, or legislative leaders to lean on the proponents of the ballot question rather than taking any specific legal action.
Right.
Got it. Okay. On to one which interestingly was not in the list of two that you read, which is the audit. And that's super interesting to me because it seems like the legislature is looking for any means, formal and informal, to gain leverage over this sort of looming audit that's kind of always out there but never moving. So why was that one not included?
We don't know why that one wasn't included. We just know that it very specifically was not. And that's a little bit odd because in a post sort of explaining why the Massachusetts Senate wanted the justices to weigh in on the two in front of us now, is they said, because of what happened with the auditor question. The quote from Senate Majority Leader Cynthia Cream was, candidly, misunderstandings and a lack of clear explanation of the constitutional implications of the audit question during the last ballot cycle have led to confusion and frustration, both on the part of the legislators who are obliged to uphold the Constitution and the voters who voted for it. So they're basically saying, we didn't get clarity last time. They didn't ask for it, to be clear. But because of what they say is a lack of clarity last time, it led to this kind of unpleasant standoff that we found ourselves in around attempts to enforce the state auditor's audit ballot measure. But they didn't include it here, even though also Senate Republicans did specifically ask the Senate leadership, hey, could you also ask the justices to weigh in on whether or not the audit ballot question was constitutional? So they have decided not to ask the SJC about that, but instead to deal with the two in front of us, which means that the audit ballot question is still going to be floating around the courts probably for some time.
And that's probably a good example, too, of the kinds of things that the legislature can do if a ballot question comes around and even passes that is, in their view, of dubious legality, which would be the same kind of label that it seems like they're seeking here. So all very interesting. Definitely more to come on that. But for now, we have much worse things to talk about. So let's wrap this up and move on to something much worse.
Let's move on to something much worse.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the Massing Polling Group. The Massing Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massingpolling.com.
And this brings us to our final segment, which this week is brought to you by Steve. Why are you trying to do this to my mind and or my body department? Because longtime listeners of this here pod will know that nothing brings Steve personally more pleasure than a, quote, innovative new beverage. Something that might, push the boundaries of flavors and morality. And there is another example of that today, known as the Ranch Dressing Milkshake. Steve, why? And why do you do this knowing that you cannot make me drink it because you are on another continent right now?
When I get back, Jen, we're going to have a taste test of all of these things, all of the disgusting beverages that we've talked about, everything viral that's happened since I've been in Kenya. We're going to collect in one room and we're going to eat and or drink it. But this particular one is served at the Great Wolf Lodge, and it is described as the savory sweet mix of vanilla ice cream, ranch dressing, and whipped. Sorry, I'm getting like a little bit of discomfort.
Yeah,
I feel like I might vomit.
Yeah, you looked a little nauseated there for a sec, bud.
Okay, I'm gonna try this again. The savory sweet mix of vanilla ice cream, ranch dressing, and whipped cream, topped with chicken nuggets, celery, and carrots with a salty lime rim. Yeah, it honestly makes me feel a little uncomfortable even reading that. But it's served at Great Wolf Lodge. It is only $8, and because we have Great Wolf Lodge right there in the great state of Massachusetts, you too can drink one if you so desire.
I would like to highlight the part of what you said, which is like under $8 or only $8 or just as though any amount of money is worth paying for what I can only describe as visually every kind of cacophonous white slop goop that you could fit into one cup. I say kindly to anyone that goes and drinks this, go with God, do not tag us in your funeral arrangements.
I'm telling you, Jen, we're going to do it. But I also have to highlight my favorite Reddit comment, which is, that does not bring the boys to my yard.
It's the reason the boys are buried in your yard.
Anyway, so if you happen to have tried that or would like to this week, please send us a review of the Ranch Dressing Milkshake. Tell us if and how all these just wild toppings fit together. And also tell us what your cardiologist thought of your decision making.
And if you could set it to bagpipes just to make our job easier at the end, or have someone like playing taps in the background, that would be phenomenal. But that is all the time we have for today, and maybe all the time you have on this earth. I'm Jennifer Smith, signing off with Steve Cazella. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cazella. You can write to us at thehorse-race-podcast@gmail.com while you still, have not crossed over this mortal coil. And don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now, subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download, and reach out to the Massink polling group if you need polls or focus groups done. Thank you all for listening. See you next week.